Thanks everyone for joining today's webinar, Preparing Clear and Effective Budgets and Budget Justifications for Proposals to the National Science Foundation's Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program. So I'm Melissa Ballard. I am the Center for Advancement of Informal Science Education, or CASE's Communications and Community Manager. I'm really happy today that CASE has partnered with NSF to bring you this webinar. I'm going to let our presenters introduce themselves.
Okay. I'm Ellen McCauley. I'm a program officer at NSF.
I'm Catherine Eberbach, and I'm a program officer at NSF.
Hi everyone, my name is Daniel McEnroe. I'm a grants officer at NSF. First of all, thank you to everyone who registered and is now observing this. We want to make sure we cover a lot of ground today. So with that being said, I'm going to give a little bit more detail about who I am. They finally let me out of the box. This is my first webinar here at NSF. I've usually done presentations where I can see everyone's smiling faces in the crowd, but that's not the case today. So all I can see is the blue sky outside and the beautiful computer screen in front of me. So like I said before, my name is Daniel McEnroe. I am a grants officer at NSF. So basically I work in the Division of Grants and Agreements. And what we do, long story short, is we review the proposals that you submit after they go through review from the panels and program officers. So again, long story short, we look at pretty much everything, but we focus on the budget and financial and administrative elements.
Okay, I'm a program officer, and so what Catherine and I are going to do today, we're going to try to flesh out what these budget categories mean in terms of ASL. So we'll be giving examples, but Daniel's going to start us off in each case.
Gotta click a bunch here. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, like Ellen said, let's just jump right into it. Okay. This, as you can see here, this is our NSF proposal budget. Okay. And when creating these, it's important to, as Melissa said, tell that story, right? It's important to remember that this is a supplement to your project narrative. It's a supplement to the overall proposal. It's a big part of what we all review here. And it needs to tell that story that's in the project narrative in the form of numbers, like what is actually going on, where's the money going, where's it being spent, that sort of thing. So today we're basically going to take each category here and we're going to dive into it a little bit, just give you guys a little bit more detail about how best to tell that story, how to break it down on paper in the form of the budget, not only the budget, but the justification as well.
So for example, as you look at this NSF budget, you'll notice that we've highlighted in yellow the main categories. So in your budget, it has A, senior personnel, B, other personnel, C, and so on. Those aren't just for your budget, they're also for your budget justification. Please make sure that you use the same titles, the same headings in your budget justification that are on this budget guide.
Okay. So as Ellen said, and I said, we're going to jump into each of these little categories here. So the first one we're going to talk about is the senior personnel and salaries and wages section. So with salaries and wages, you want to make sure that everything is broken out and tied back to not only the budget, but also the narrative. So for example, as you can see, the PI is listed here. Obviously, this is a sample budget justification, so we're not giving away personal data. And it lists their responsibilities, it lists their duties, it lists their salary, how it's broken down year by year, and allows us to go, okay, here's the narrative, we look at the next section, we look at the budget where it's just the line items, and then we immediately go, okay, A, senior personnel, here's the PI, here's the co-PI, here's their duties, here's their responsibilities. We can tie that back and match it up year by year and get a good understanding of what they're doing. Supplement to the overall proposal in general. Would that be an accurate thing?
Yeah, and so then the first question we always get from those of you who are on soft money or at soft money institutions when it comes to senior personnel, you're aware that NSF has a 2-month maximum across all NSF funded proposals for senior personnel. And you say, wait a minute, but I'm on soft money, how does that work? So that 2-month maximum assumes that your organization has as research and development a part of your core work. If that is not the case, so for example, if you're soft money institution, soft money, or if what you're proposing with NSF is outside your current scope of work, you can ask for real costs. But in there, you would need to say, I am asking for funding in addition to or more than the standard 2 months because, and then explain what your situation is. I'm a soft money institution, I work on soft money, this is outside the normal scope of work, etc. But that is expected for senior personnel if you're asking for more than 2 months salary over all your NSF proposals. That isn't the case, however, for other personnel. You can ask for actual costs for other personnel.
Now, Ellen, just as a quick question, this is all something this could be put into the budget justification under senior personnel, correct? Or
Yeah,
is this talked about before the proposal is submitted?
Oh, no, this is, you don't talk about it in the narrative.
Okay.
You talk about it only in the budget
That's the
justification.
question. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
Cool. All right, so moving on. Again, we're not covering every little section of the budget like we showed in the beginning slide, but we want to talk about the key ones. So moving on from salaries and wages, we get to travel. Now, travel, when anticipated, is in a similar manner to every line item we're going to talk about, needs, but travel specifically. As you can see in this example, this is one that I crafted just to show what a, kind of like a setting the bar example looks like. And it's, the key takeaway is it's broken down. It's clear and concise and broken out. Year by year, activity by activity, where people are going, who's going, how much it costs to get there, what the lodging requirements are, what the airfare requirements are, or not requirements, but costs, estimates exactly. And there are some key policy factors to remember here that come into play. Make sure that everything is reasonable. You're not flying first class somewhere, and you're not flying.
This is the government.
Right, you're not flying on a foreign air carrier. That's a big thing we always usually check on our reviews and everything, is the Fly America Act. So just these are things to keep in the back of your mind when you're crafting these budgets. Just break them down, who's going where, who's doing what, how much it costs. And the other thing to remember is this travel category, line item E, is only for faculty and staff. It's not for participants. We'll cover that in a couple more slides, but keep in mind, make sure that these people are faculty or staff of the institution.
Yes, of the project. And I think that's really important because there'll be other places where travel will be, there'll be travel expenses, perhaps associated with advisors or consultants or contractors. And that is elsewhere in the budget justification and elsewhere in the budget line items. And I think when we get to those, are we getting to those?
Yes.
Okay, I hope so. Yeah. And I would just like to say one more thing about travel.
Okay.
So travel is probably one of the more sensitive expenses that you were requesting, and it'll probably be one of those places where there's particular scrutiny. And I just wanted you to be thinking about that. We want to be able to support the travel needs that support the goals and the activities of the proposal and project, but really just consider that this is a sensitive expense.
Yeah, and when you're talking about faculty and staff, you mean A, B,
And
So-
C.
And C
Yeah.
personnel, correct.
Yeah.
Right, that's kind of, we'll cover it in a little bit more detail,
yeah,
but yeah.
but A, B, and C.
So it's not always faculty.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
why. So we want everybody to know, we know it's not always faculty, but I
Right.
think, so we're thinking of that as the PIs and senior personnel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Okay,
Let's talk
all right.
about. And here we go, right into, if you want to talk about subject sections of the budget that are under scrutiny, we got it right here, participant support.
Here's another one.
It is a cornerstone budget section for a lot of the proposals we review. It can significantly delay our processing and our review, especially in the grants office, when funds are not allocated in this category correctly. And the key, again, I'm going to use the words clear and concise for pretty much every one of these slides, because that's really the name of the game. We want everything to be itemized. We want it to be very descriptive, but not over the top. We just really, the budget justification is not a essay. It's not a term paper. It is a just
5-page max.
five-page max.
pages
Exactly.
maximum, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
so for
Right.
everything.
Yeah, don't try to use the period trick to make everything bigger. That doesn't matter here. We want everything to just be broken out. And so with participant support, we have different categories. We have 4 categories underneath the overall participant support line item. F1, stipends, F2, travel, F3, subsistence, and F4, other. Now, it's up to you what your project will require out of these. Whether or not it's paying students to participate, that can go into a stipend. Whether or not they're going somewhere, it's travel. Whether or not you're feeding participants, that's subsistence. And then F4, other. These categories and moving money out of that category all require NSF prior approval to make any sort of change. So when at the time of proposal submission, it's very important to have everything as clear as possible throughout the whole years of the project, because once it's awarded, it requires prior approval, it requires review, it requires all sorts of different changes. Like Catherine said about travel, participant support is also one that's under a lot of scrutiny.
So let's talk about what a participant is in the ASL category. If you have youth who are mentoring other youth and they're receiving a stipend, they're helping with the project, yes, but they're also a recipient, a target audience of the project. So they would probably be participants. The high school youth or the elementary, early childhood, any recipient of programming, they're participants. Let's say this is a professional development for informal science education educators or scientists who are at universities or at public gardens, etc., and they are receiving training. If you're doing training or providing services, those folks, the recipients of the training, the services, the programming, those are all categorized as participant support. So it's not just youth, it's not just kids, it's who the recipient is, who's being trained, or the recipient of programming.
So I actually had a couple things down here that I did want to say. All right, so this is kind of dumb, but I had it written here that
It's not dumb.
It's important to remember the 5 W's plus H, if you remember that little moniker, for participant support, right? So who is participating, okay? This is to ensure they are not faculty or staff. Remember how we talked about before that A through C is for faculty or staff, and then travel.
Project staff.
Project staff.
Project staff,
Right.
thank you.
Project staff,
Right.
correct. And then E, travel, is for project staff again. Well, with participant support, that is not the right category for them. And then 2, where are they coming from? So that goes into travel. Is it going to be participant support travel? And then 3, when are they arriving? Again, which year of the project? What year, sorry, that's the 4th W. And then how are they getting there? And then also, one of the biggest kickers is that indirect costs are not to be recovered on participant support funds. That was really that's what causes the delay, is because we'll see, and we'll get to this later in the indirect cost section, but basically we'll see participant support funds as the total base, and we'll have to go through a whole revision process to change that.
So yes, youth can attend a conference with you. Youth can go to a youth conference. Youth can go to other places. In some cases, yes, you can have youth, you can help youth defray the cost of buses and other forms of public transportation to get to the program. That would go under travel, but anything that has to do with those participants is under F. And on your budget justification, you're not just going to put F, participant support, you're going to go F1, stipends, describe that. F2, travel. Now this seems so basic, but there's so many proposals that don't give us this wayfinding mechanism, and it delays your proposal and it confuses reviewers.
It actually can also confuse us.
Is the cornerstone budget section for a lot of
Oh,
What?
It can significantly.
Oh, so.
sorry, my fault. Okay, go ahead, Catherine.
Okay, we good?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to say, I know that sometimes I don't want to sound like a bureaucrat, but I really think your point that you just made about wayfinding isn't just for reviewers, it's actually for NSF. And so, you know, we, the program officers, are going to be looking at the budgets carefully. The grants administrators will also be looking at the budgets carefully, and we were going to be looking for this information and to make sure that it's there. I'd like to say this is not the time to be creative. Be creative in your narrative. Be creative in the ideas you're putting forward. But really, if we're talking about stipends, it's F.1. It's not just there. It's not just stipends. And it just really helps us to locate this and move it forward. And I do think when that in fact is done well and that's included, I find that expedites review in terms of the budget and connecting that back to the narrative. And that's one thing that I think we're going to reinforce here again as well, that connection between this budget and all the explanations in the budget is a reflection of the narrative that you are proposing. So this is all one part of one document, one comprehensive piece of information that you're trying to communicate. So if you think about it that way, not as just some, a way of really, let's get the money and what is the money we're asking for? It's really trying to help to really build your case. And I think it also demonstrates that you are actually competitive as a proposal.
Any questions on what we've talked about so far?
Yeah, that's why I came on screen. We're getting a few questions in the questions.
Enthusiastically just going on.
Yeah.
All right. So hopefully this is a quick one. Is the 5-page limit for just your own organization's budget justification, or does the limit count for the lead institution plus sub-awardees?
Lead institution only. So if you have a sub-award or subcontracts, et cetera, they can have 5 pages as well.
Okay. One related to travel, specifically the PI meeting. When are the PI meetings at NSF? What years? Are they every other year? And can more than one PI from a project attend?
So they are every other year. There will be one in 2019, and so there'll be another one in 2021. We ask that you only budget for the PI to go. If there's extra room, you can send someone else, but we end up with almost 300 people, and we want to keep it relatively intimate. So we ask that you only budget for your PI. But you're welcome to see if there's space, but then you'll have to find money from your budget in other places, et cetera, to attend, if you want someone else to attend.
And then we have a few about eligible items and which category they might go into. So one person asked, if our project includes a day-long informal learning event, can we provide light food for participants? And can we pay for space?
Okay, so this is very tricky. In some cases, you can provide light refreshments and snacks. You can never provide dinner. If it is a working meeting, on occasion you can provide, if it's like a conference or a conference within a larger grant, you can ask for a working breakfast or a working lunch if it is unreasonable, given what you're trying to do and your location, to take a real break, have people leave, etc. So if you're pushed for time, you can request that. In most cases, that would be, so if you're talking about participants in a conference, or if you're talking about meetings, that's typically in participant support. Note that A through C, your senior personnel and other staff, cannot be supported. So if you can't have an internal meeting and request food, etc. for that. Now, if you need to rent a room for this event, that's typically in G6, other.
And there are a couple other clarifications about what falls into that participant support category. I think you might have touched on them, but I want to just ask them again so people feel like their questions were answered. So the rental of facility to support participant learning, is that under participant support costs?
It's often under G6. Yeah, if you're renting a facility, that's typically under G6.
Yeah, it says, so our costs such as room rental fees, etc., related to NSF-sponsored conferences consider participant support costs? No. The participant support cost line in the NSF budget should not be used for such costs.
That's good when we feel like we're answering these correctly and we check the book.
Yep.
You'll notice, go to the PAPPG. We do regularly.
All the time.
And I'll talk about this little resource in a few slides too. So.
And then one final question for this round of Q&A. So the training materials that we might purchase for a program, is that a participant support cost or something else?
Training materials, that is probably in G1 under materials and supplies. So if it is not going, If it's not directly going to the body of the participant, it is typically in G.
Great, and I'll hand it back up to you guys. I know a few questions came in, but we'll save them for our next break for questions.
Sounds good.
Okay.
It's just my little slide. Yeah. So speaking of, we had a couple questions reference this category of G, right? So G is basically everything else. So we've touched on our salaries and wages, we've touched on our travel, we've touched on our participant support, and then we get to the real like meat of the budget, which is our G costs. So we have G1, which is materials and supplies, G2, publication costs, G3, consultant services, G4, computer services, G5, subawards, and then G6, other. So today, I believe we're going to talk about consultant services a little bit. We're going to talk about subawards. We're going to talk about G6, other. Of course, please ask questions about everything, but we're just going to, the next few slides, talk about these three. So the first one is our consultant services. So basically, consultants provide a service to the project through individual service arrangements with your institution, okay? And these people are usually a noted individual, and they're usually experts in their field. That's why they're being hired to provide this service. They must be justified. The information, again, must be clear and concise. And all of their travel costs, all of their salary arrangements has to be broken out in this category, in this line item, by year. So don't put it into participant support, even though these consultants may be helping to arrange a meeting or evaluate a meeting. They're not part of the meeting. They are a separate service for a specific action for the project. Catherine, do you have any?
So in breaking that out, one of the things that I think we all like to do or be able to do in reading your budgets is to understand how the numbers were constructed. So saying consultant X will be paid $10,000. We actually, it's not that insufficient information. We really want to understand how those numbers were constructed. So what was that person's daily rate? How many days per year? And how many times, how many years would that be covering? And that would also include the individuals or the groups, whatever, travel and those kinds of related expenses are part of that.
And if you think we're just being picky, look at the PAPPG under consultant services. You'll see that it says what's the scope of work and everything else that Catherine said that you need to include. So do include that in your budget justification.
Nobody's actually mentioned form, but I actually do. I'm always pretty happy to see tables. I mean, there's a lot of text, and sometimes tables will save you some space. If you're really looking for space saving places, and tables do really communicate a lot of information when properly constructed.
Right. I was going to follow up with that. Okay. I was going to say find that balance between not being too creative.
Right.
And the tables, because sometimes the tables can get a little confusing because people add in colors or all sorts of things. Try to find a balance between like, boom, this is person X is consultant or travel meeting one, airfare, lodging, car rental, done right there. That's all you need. You don't need to keep going grandiose with it. So yeah, just watch out for formatting, I guess is a better way to put it. Okay, so moving on, this is G5. So these are subawards, right? So subawards, again, like participant support, like travel, like pretty much every line item in the budget, comes under scrutiny, but subawards, considering it's money that's flowing to a sub-awardee that your institution becomes the prime awardee of oversight for, it's very important because it can cause delays. Again, if we don't feel that the necessary justification has been provided, again, going back to that maximum page limit and everything, your institution gets 5 pages and then the subaward institution gets 5 pages for their own whole separate justification. Everything we're talking about today for the prime awardees justification and budget, take it right, copy and paste, Control-C, Control-V to any institution or organization that you bring on as a subaward. Everything has to apply to their budget too. So when we're reviewing it, we're viewing the exact same way. We're looking through, we're going, okay, budget 1, scroll through, reading for the prime, and then we go right into the subaward, if they're subawards, and we check it against everything that we've seen in the justification for the prime. So remember the difference between one of the things we had here to talk about is the difference between, like, what is a subaward? What is its role in the proposal? What are you bringing them on for? And the main thing to remember is that a subaward is a legal transfer of effort for research and development, right? A good example is an academic institution providing this research and participating in the project meetings and the dissemination of the results. So for example, this is somebody that is you brought on, they are actively playing a role in the development of the project. Now this is different from, let's say, what we talked about before with, as a consultant. That's a very specific service. It's a procurement relationship. You come up with an agreement for them to provide one specific thing or several specific things throughout the life of the project. They're not coming to the PI meetings. They're not involved in the research. They're just completing a task for the project. And they would go in a separate category. They're not a subawardee.
Okay,
A couple
so,
more things, but I just wanted to.
yeah, so let's
Flow a
talk
little
for a
bit.
second.
Yeah.
Do you want to
I
talk
had
about?
one thing I'd
Yeah,
just like
please.
point out. So I thought that was really interesting. I think it's an important point of the legal transfer of effort. And so one of the things that I see, and we always often have to correct this. So for the lead organization, there is a PI, but there's also a PI for the subawards. So each subaward has its own PI, and it's from that institution. Yes, it is. And so just be aware. So it's not like if say John X is the PI for the overall project, John X will not show up as the PI on the subaward. Let me put it that way.
That's a good point.
It is from another individual, and it's from that organization, or else it's
a problem.
Okay, so, but let's clarify. There's one PI for a project.
Yep.
If it is a collaborative project, you have one PI from each lead institution. You also can have co-PIs. When Catherine is talking about the PI for the subaward, that isn't the same as your lead PI, and that person does not have to be a co-PI. It is basically the lead for the subaward.
Okay.
So the language can get confusing.
okay. But it just yes.
Okay, so your subaward, it's for an organization that is doing something that is inherent to the project, to completing the project goals. It is part of the project team, so it might be a community-based organization, it may be a media company, it might be a research institution. In AZLE, there's so many different options, but they are part of the core work of the proposed project, where your consultant is services rendered. And we want to talk a little bit about contracts, which also you fill out the same forms as the subaward, but the nature of the relationship is a little bit different.
It's very different. Yeah, hold on, let's see. So contract is a requisition for goods or services. Like I mentioned before, it's a procurement relationship. An example of this again would be the consultant arrangement. That's why I figured
So the other
Before we got too
time,
far into
so
it,
you
but
can, so a consultant is often an individual or a small organization.
Right.
You can have subcontracts, if I understand this correctly,
Mhm.
that use the subaward mechanism, because we only have one form for that. But you call it a subcontract. You fill all that out, and they're basically, that's an organization rendering
a service.
a service.
Okay, that's correct.
That's larger,
Right,
as
right,
opposed to a consultant agreement, which is usually an individual or a small
Completely
organization.
Okay. Yeah. Again, the wording is.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you have questions on that, specific questions, in general, if they're a task for the project, consultant or contract. If they are part of the project, they're a subaward.
There you go.
Yeah?
Yeah, good way to sum it up.
So Melissa, this might be a really good time to ask some more questions because we're about to pivot pretty significantly.
Okay, yeah, we have many questions. This is kind of probably backing up a couple of steps, but someone asked, is there like a broader definition of how you define senior and key personnel?
You want to take that one? You need to.
Okay,
Senior personnel.
Yeah.
Senior personnel is the leadership team. It's your co-PI, it's your PI, your co-PI, and the real leadership. All right, your intellectual. It's your intellectual lead. Okay. The other personnel, they're the people who get it done. Now, in some cases, your senior personnel also are the people who get it done, depending on the size of the project, etc. But if you don't think of them as the intellectual lead, they came up with the idea, or they're really who is conceptualizing and advancing the field. They are the advancers of the field intellectually. The other personnel are really important, but they're the ones making it go. I hope that is good
They're
enough.
operational liaison.
Yeah. They're also the graduate students, and they're the undergrads, and they're the youth mentors.
Postdocs.
Yeah.
Okay. And are you guys going to talk more about advisory boards and external evaluators, or should we ask
Go for
those?
it.
All right.
Ask
So about an external evaluator, are these consultants? Will we put the cost there?
Usually we see on proposals that it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about consultants. That service that they're providing as an external evaluator would be considered a consultant arrangement. But again, it depends on, we've also seen it as a sub-award. Going to Ellen's point about the organization that is brought on as a sub-award, subcontract to provide that service
But
too.
it's typically under consultants.
Exactly.
If you've got an advisory board, you've got 6 people that are going to do that work.
Right.
So you list all their names, their expertise,
Exactly.
and then they'll have generally one scope of work. Typically, it's the same number of hours, not always, and the detail that Catherine talked about that you need per consultant.
Exactly, yeah.
I think that actually just checked off a few of those advisory board questions as well. So if one of their advisors is international, does that have any ramifications for it being an NSF project? US based.
Okay, so let's talk about international for a moment. ASL only funds project activities that occur in the US, with a few exceptions. That said, if you have key personnel, senior personnel, or key consultants, advisors, etc., who bring something to the table internationally, whether their perspective, their expertise, etc., you include them in the normal place that you would include anyone else in the budget, so consultants, etc. You cannot have a foreign national or someone who is working outside the U.S. serve as a PI. Now, you can have someone who is a non-U.S. citizen serve as a PI, as long as they're based at a U.S. institution and they have legal paperwork to work in the U.S.
And then a few questions about, again, back to consultants. So another question I've been related to the letter of collaboration, which I know you like to address. So someone asked, do you want information about the consultant's expertise, daily rate, scope of work, and a letter of collaboration? Or where would you put that?
You put that in the budget justification. When Daniel and Catherine were saying, we want to know their name, their expertise, their scope of work, their daily rate, the number of hours per year, etc. That goes in the budget justification, and that is in the PAPPG under consultants of what you have to put in to receive that funding. So if you don't put enough information in for us to understand what they're doing and who's doing it, we won't fund it.
And is there some sort of dollar amount cutoff at which a consultant should be a sub-award, or in sense that it's indicating they're a bigger chunk of your project?
It goes back to what Ellen and all of us have talked about in terms of justifying.
And it has to be a reasonable rate.
Exactly, it has to be a reasonable rate. It has to be fully backed up. It has to be basically vetted in what we're going to read, what you put in your justification for this person. So,
but going back to your project description and narrative, it has to be defensible.
Right. Allocable.
So, yeah.
And also, actually, on the quick note, because you did mention subawards in that question too. So with subawards, and I should have mentioned this earlier, but subawards also fall into indirect cost calculations as well, because most of the time, depending on your rate agreement and everything, which we'll talk about on pretty much the last slide, that base affects the overall budget of the process too. So depending on how many subawards you have, your calculations are going to be different too. Consultants are usually part of the general direct costs line item, so it's not usually a problem, but with a subaward, it can affect that as well. So.
All right, and I'm just being conscious of time. I know we've got about 20 minutes left, and you guys have more content to share. I know there's lots of questions in the question box. Again, this was an experimental webinar, so we will definitely make sure to figure out a way to get those questions answered, even if we don't answer them verbally. So I will hand it back to NSF to keep going with their presentation.
All right, so this is an example of the G6 other category. So remember this, we're still under that umbrella of other direct costs. So the G1 through G6 line items on the budget and their requisite justification. So this is the G6 other. So a big example of G6 other costs are incentive payments, right? Incentive payments, when necessary to accomplish program objectives and of reasonable amount, incentives costs can be allowable. You have to remember with incentive costs that they have to be easily trackable. So this is something where you want to bring in people to the project. You want people to fill out a survey, for example, or something like that. You can't just go up to them and throw them 20 bucks and say, hey, fill out this survey. No, that is not the case. So we need it to have numbers. We need to be, again, I'm going to use those two words, clear and concise. It has to be clear and concise with incentive payments as well. You don't have to list every person that you're going to pay in the survey responded, right? That's not what we're asking for. We're saying we are going to conduct a 50-person survey, right? We are going to pay each person with an American Express cash card, right? These are the numbers. Here's how we're going to track it. We don't need to have every number. We don't need to go into that minute detail. But basically, if we came out to your organization and saw, okay, this survey was conducted in year 2. Here's how it was tracked. Here's the numbers. Here's the cost that we paid each person. That is what we want to see an outline for in the justification for incentive payments.
And just Daniel provided an example. We are not beholden to any company or any kind of cash card, etc. Whatever makes most sense to you. Just be aware, NSF does not fund gifts. NSF does not fund souvenirs, T-shirts, etc. We recognize it might be cheaper to provide those, but legally, we cannot fund that. So legally, you can't use NSF funding for hats, T-shirts, etc., pencils. You can't do it. No. Yeah. Logo wear. No. Swag. No.
I think so. I mentioned the 5 W's and how for participant support. I have some questions here for incentive payments, different from those. If it's ever unclear whether or not an incentive cost will be needed or something like that, just have these in the back of your head. Okay, so what leads you to believe that participation is unlikely without the use of an incentive? What is the estimated impact without the use of an incentive? How will incentives be distributed and tracked? So we've talked about this already. Remember, we just want an outline of how your organization or how you plan to keep a track of these funds that are going to be leaving the project. People are coming in to do something, they're going to be leaving the project. That's what we're going to focus on. And then what is the justification for the amount to be considered? And is it reasonable?
Okay. And there we go.
Ooh, all right. Here we go. So this is the big one. While every budget category can cause delays, and certainly the ones we have discussed, it is indirect costs that are usually the culprit. It is imperative that the current federally negotiated rate be utilized and that the base be calculated according to this agreement. Okay. Now I know everyone's institution is different. Everyone has a different background. Everyone has a different role to play. So from my vantage point in the grants office, this is something that we usually discuss with like the sponsor research office or something like that. Those are the ones who are negotiating the rate. They're in charge with keeping a track of it. Now, as I'm not sure who we have in attendance today, so I'm going to speak generally about it. The most common way to calculate indirect costs is the modified total direct costs base. Okay, so this is all in line I of the budget. Okay, so as we're scrolling through, we're pretty much looking at everything else, and then we'll get to indirect costs and go, wait a second, what's going on here? You know, why do we see all of the costs? They hit $1 million in participant support, and all of it's down here and it's calculated as the base. Boom, right there we have an issue. It's going to need a revised budget because you cannot charge participant support as indirect. So again, I'm kind of digressing here. The main thing is to remember just that it's a big deal to have the current negotiated rate in place. It has to be current. You can't deviate. You can't use an old rate that expired 3 years ago and say, oh, you're saving the government money. That's not how it works. That's considered a violation of NSF's cost sharing policy. And basically, if the organization, again, everyone's different, does not have a current negotiated rate, NSF has in place the 10% de minimis rate, which can also be utilized. And usually you guys see this before I do, so the proposals. So
Do you want to say something, Charlie?
I just want to say, I wonder if people are clear what indirect costs are
Okay.
and what it does for the prime organization. Can you say something about that? 'Cause I'm not sure it's clear.
So indirect costs, as we've talked about all the things above it. Those are your direct costs. Indirect costs are basically everything else that goes on in support of a project. So I think the best example is usually like keeping the lights on, or water in the building, rent, things of that nature. Am I correct in that? Like it's the general costs in support of a project. You can't run a lab to do research without electricity, that sort of thing. But I know it can get complicated because all the rate agreements are different and everybody has different things that are charged to it.
So your organization has an indirect cost rate that's negotiated with some agency in the federal government. If it doesn't, you use 10%. Okay. With NSF, you either have to if you have a government or an agency negotiated indirect cost rate, you have to use them. If you don't have one of those, you have to use 10% because NSF is a full reimbursement agency. Now, let's say that your sponsored resource office has given you a letter that says you have a 52% and a federally negotiated indirect rate, and it's with the National Science Foundation. So you'll see on the slide, what you see is the rate, the agency, when it was approved, and you'll note that you apply this indirect rate to A through E, not F, and then G. Now, you should have help with this because on subawards, you apply the indirect cost rate to the first $25,000 of each subaward per award, not per year. So if you have additional questions on that, we'll take them in a moment. Anything else to say on indirect cost rates? Okay. Okay, I love this one. So what happens if my project costs more than what I'm asking NSF for? All right, with AZLE, we have some huge projects, some $6 million films, some youth programs, and some research that cost more than you can ask NSF for. Our max is $3 million. So what do? In your project narrative, you're talking about what's the concept for the entire project. All right, that's the whole thing. But what you then focus on is what part of that project are you asking NSF for? Okay, you're asking NSF funds to fund this out of the whole project. When it comes to your budget is only about what you're asking NSF to fund. So then you say, okay, but how do I indicate that I've got other sponsors or other federal money or private money, or I'm looking for money, or I've got partners, etc. You put that in the facilities, equipment, and other resources. Now, I want to be really clear. When you put other information about the larger project in facilities, equipment, and other resources, it has to be non-quantifiable, no numbers. So you can say, I am approaching X foundation for additional funds, or I have secured additional funds. Notice I'm saying additional funds. I am not saying the numbers from other agencies or from others. My partners are X, Y, and Z, okay? But in your narrative, you're talking about enough about the full project, but most of it is about what you're asking NSF to fund. In your budget, it's only what you're asking NSF to fund. And if there's other non-quantifiable information you think we should know, it's in facilities, equipment, and other resources. So that doesn't mean that if you've got a $6 million film, we're not interested. We just want to know what slice you're asking us to fund.
Or exhibition, or
yes.
research.
Absolutely.
So, and this is grounded in NSF's, as I say, and this is grounded in NSF's commitment to no cost share. And that is an equity issue for us. So just be aware of that.
Yeah. Now then.
Speaking of resources, the following resources we have listed here are available to assist you. We referenced the first one. It's the NSF Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, otherwise known as the PAP-G. Right now, the link takes you to the 18-1, which is the most recent one. I believe they're working on making changes to it. Might be releasing another one too, but.
Yeah, so let me say one thing about that. The first document that's released each year, even if it doesn't come out first, is 18-1, 19-1, it's the year -1, and that is always the PAPPG. So if you put in NSF 18-1, NSF 19-1, the 19-1, the fiscal year for the federal government starts October 1st, so it should be coming out soon, and you all do a good job with those announcements.
Right.
So.
Usually, yeah. So the next one I have actually behind me, one of the issues. These are pretty fantastic. We use them all the time just because it lays everything out clearly and concisely. So this one's called "What Participant Support Costs Explained," and it's issue number 2. And I have the link here. And these are put out by our NSF policy office. And each issue covers a myriad of different topics, but usually they'll have a page referencing budget categories. So in this case, that issue was participant support. And then obviously, Ellen will speak to the last item we have listed here, which is, again, very important.
Okay, so your solicitation has information about what's allowed and what's not allowable in budgets. For example, AZL does not fund equipment. We do not fund capital costs. We do not fund buildings, etc. So do look in the solicitation for specific criteria with respect to what you can ask for and what you can't ask for. We're ready for questions again, yes?
So, yeah. Speaking of asking, ask early and ask often.
All right, so we have tons and tons of questions. What I try to do is group them by kind of similarity. So I'm going to start with the ones where people had a lot of questions about, and we are going to go back to some of the topics you covered towards the beginning of your presentation.
Okay.
So to start off with, there are a few questions about having whether it's a partner or a person or consultant, like actually determined and solidified at the time of submission. So someone asked about their sub-awards. They're thinking about collaborating with 5 cities or sites across the country. They have the locations, but they don't actually have their particular partners. Can they include just a certain allotment and say that they're going to choose those later? There's another question about a consultant to write a computer program. Can they just include a market rate for a programmer and select that person later?
So those are 2 very different questions. In terms of a programmer, if a programmer isn't a core part, like is their expertise or who they are in particular key to the project? If not, then it's less important. That would be other personnel. You're hiring a programmer. If it's a partner, a core part of your project, NSF AZL is really competitive. We want to see, and the reviewers want to see, and you will be competing against proposals that really have done the research on who should be the partner, who makes sense, and they make a case for those partners. Now, there are certain cases where a partner that you're going to need 4 years down the road may not be identifiable now. But I really would think about, is it going to make sense with the rationale of your project why you don't know who your partners are now? If the rationale suggests that you should, the reviewers are going to note that. And there are enough projects that are very well constructed and who really have worked on their partnerships that you'll be competing against them.
And there are a few folks that still wanted some clarifications about talking about sub-awards versus consultants, how you decide. Is there the difference between consultants and contractors? Maybe just repeating a couple of those, I guess, general definitions, because there are a lot of people who wanted some additional clarification. I think you're on mute.
Oh, we were on mute for a reason.
Okay.
Okay, so sub-awards are those who are part of the project, who have key roles in the project. Consultants are key individuals or small organizations who are providing a service. Typically, in most of the projects I fund, there aren't subcontracts. But subcontracts would be an organization, like a larger part of a, we don't see it a lot.
Well, I can say, actually, no, the places where you might see a contract is, for example, you're developing a technological
That's true.
Resource, and the expertise among the PIs is really the conceptual and actually the theoretical and the research space. But you're really needing somebody outside that to really design and really work on the program and the software or whatever the mechanisms are that you're designing. And in that case, I've often seen that being a contract, because that's really significant work that it allows the intellectual work and the outreach to happen.
So then you're going to ask, what forms do you use? You use the exact same forms as you do for subawards. We don't have a different set of forms, which is basically the same forms that it's a budget and a budget justification.
And a few.
Sorry.
And then a few folks had questions about incentives. So understanding that gifts are unallowable, but they're thinking about for a student completing a survey, could they give a pencil or sort of an object?
No, we recognize that sounds really silly. This is not something that NSF has decided. This is federal law. We are trying to protect you and keep you safe. And therefore we're saying no gifts, no pencils, no pens, no swag. Sorry.
Right.
Now, you can do that if you want, but do not spend NSF money on it. If you have another source of income to pay for that, that is fine. But then you shouldn't be asking NSF for funds for that. That's got to come separately because we are a no-cost share organization. But you cannot spend NSF money on that kind of thing. Daniel was very clear. Cash cards, trackable.
And then jumping to another topic. So on advisor stipends, is there a dollar limit? Let's say there is larger than a sort of a typical NSF rate. Can you use their own hourly rate?
There's a couple of issues there. One is that it has to be a reasonable rate, a reasonable market rate, basically. Yes, you can pay, people can be reimbursed or paid for different rates. But here's the thing I would look at. If you are looking at multiple advisors on an advisory board, and there's somebody who has an extraordinary typical rate, and others are much less so, you might want to consider issues of equity. And I know we've discussed that within particular projects and so forth. So you just might want to consider that. So if somebody says my rate is $5,000 and everybody else is getting paid $1,000, that's just something you have to really think about, or $500 a day. I mean, it's just whatever it is, whatever that rate is, you have to just actually do. I think you have to do some thinking or asking the PIs about that.
If you're new, you may want to ask some established PIs how they've handled some of these situations. I mean, if you're applying for NSF funding, you should be well networked or be working on your network. So call up PIs, see them at conferences, ask, see them at your professional associations and ask how they handle some of these things.
All right, so if you know a PI or perhaps other senior project personnel is moving institutions in the near future, how might you reflect that in your proposal or not?
So if you know someone is moving institutions and you know that they're moving institutions in December and you're applying in November, you can only apply for what's real at the time. I mean, if you know they have a job at that one, you can only apply for what's real at the time. So what do you know at the time? In December, do you know that they're taking that job? And if you do, apply with them at that institutions. If it is not a done deal, then go ahead.
I'll say, just as an aside to that, when we issue an NSF award, it belongs to the institution. So I know it's not exactly in line with that question, but we get it. Yes, it's something important to remember. If somebody's going to be leaving,
and it's the PI,
then that doesn't officially have any sort of thing to do with each other. It belongs to the institution that we gave the money to. So that PI needs to leave, but they need to have arrangements made of who's going to be taken over, or if the institution's even wants to get rid of, or not get rid of the project, but pass it on. Exactly. Right. Otherwise, it could be an issue.
Yeah. So I think one of the, I personally experienced this myself. Not because I I anticipated, but I did leave the organization after I was a PI and for a couple of years. And you have to understand that the project actually is owned by or controlled or owned by the organization, not the individual PI.